In the fall of 1961, Kennedy would face yet another grave foreign policy decision, this time in Southeast Asia. A communist-backed insurgency was gaining momentum in South Vietnam, destabilizing the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem. U.S. military and intelligence officials believed the insurgency could be defeated and lobbied for the introduction of U.S. combat troops. But those familiar with the failed French colonial war in Vietnam just a decade earlier had serious doubts.
JFK understood, because he had been in Vietnam during the waning years of the French colonial presence, that it would be virtually impossible to defeat a Vietnamese movement, whether it was communist-led or not, that had nationalist credentials, that represented Vietnamese nationalism.
The reason why the war in Indochina has not had the support of the people of that area and the people of Asia has been that the French have maintained too great a degree of control over the lives of the people. And therefore, the communists under Ho Chi Minh are able to claim that they are fighting for independence, and the French appear to be fighting for a maintenance of colonial rule. I therefore believe that before the United States moves in any degree, that independence must be granted to the people, that the people must support the struggle, because unless, as I said, that support is forthcoming, any intervention by the United States is bound to be futile.
John Kennedy understood that the age of colonialism was over.
President Kennedy was not going to introduce combat troops into Vietnam.
So the first challenge to JFK's fundamental position of trying to keep the United States out of war in Southeast Asia came in 1961.
The consensus view in the military and intelligence establishment was that we had to protect South Vietnam, that was our client, our ally, that we had a moral obligation to stand by President Diem and to protect South Vietnam from North Vietnam.
The military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, really had bought into the idea that we could win in South Vietnam militarily.
This is the issue that comes up in November of 1961 with the Taylor-Rostow report, which recommends the introduction of combat troops.
This was saying we want 40,000 troops to go into South Vietnam and defeat the Viet Cong. And then we want to have 125, 130,000 troops just in case North Vietnam and China intervene, just to handle that possible contingency. JFK told his national security advisors, we're not going to do this. Based on my experience and my knowledge, my personal knowledge of Vietnam, this isn't going to work. And this is not an interest that deserves the United States going to war. So it was a very decisive moment when a U.S. president really responded to a very serious proposal for going to war with a very loud no. However, as part of the political positioning that he felt that he had to assume, he then made a deal that he would agree to their request for thousands of U.S. advisors.
Advisors is an important word. They were military for the most part. A lot of them were economic aid people too. But it was President Kennedy's insistence that it not be our war that limited our involvement in that kind of way. We would do everything we could to advise and to train, but Kennedy was determined that it wouldn't be us that would be in the front lines.
Across the globe in South Vietnam, some of the newly arrived U.S. advisors were defying orders and actually engaging in combat.
The North Vietnamese leadership, they were very vulnerable, very subject to the threat of intervention by the United States in South Vietnam, and they wanted to do everything possible to avoid that. And so they did, in fact, begin to talk about the necessity for some kind of negotiated agreement, some kind of negotiated settlement in South Vietnam.
That information reached Kennedy's appointed ambassador to India, John Kenneth Galbraith.
One of the reasons that President Kennedy chose my father to be ambassador to India rather than keeping him in Washington was that this permitted Kennedy to call on my father as a foreign policy advisor. He had the experience of watching the French defeat in Indochina in 1954, so he had views on these matters, and those views were close to Kennedy's own.
So Galbraith sent a letter to Kennedy in April of 1962. Well, what Galbraith was suggesting was that they could get the Indian government to help establish some kind of contact with the North Vietnamese. There could be some talk about a deal under which, if they would lower the level of insurgency, we would then begin to withdraw troops. We could talk about some corresponding efforts or moves to reduce tensions and reduce the level of war. And JFK definitely bought into that. But the State Department was filled up with holdovers from the Eisenhower administration, people who had these very right-wing views on East Asian policy. And so JFK understood that. He knew he was going to have to work around the State Department bureaucracy, and really Harriman was the logical person for him to turn to.
Averell Harriman was a very experienced diplomat. He had been ambassador to the Soviet Union in the Second World War. He'd been governor of New York.
Harriman had called for avoiding sending troops to Vietnam in November of 1961. But what happened was that Harriman migrated from JFK's side of the ledger to the coalition of military and State Department people who were calling for sending troops to South Vietnam. And I don't think JFK understood the degree to which he had really turned to the other side on that question. JFK ordered Averell Harriman to send a cable that instructed Galbraith to establish a negotiating channel with North Vietnam. What is so interesting about the document is that immediately Harriman, very heavy pencil, crosses out the part of the direction from the president that calls for mutual de-escalation. He actually sat on the negotiating cable, and in fact, when one of his subordinates tried to write a cable that was headed in that direction, he said, no, we're not going to do that. And there was never a cable sent. So it was an astonishing case of a leading official of the State Department completely subverting an explicit order from the president for trying to carry out a diplomatic policy. What Harriman did, I think, was a reflection of a much broader pattern in which all of these advisors were essentially subverting what JFK wanted to do.
There was a mindset that said no negotiations from weakness, and we're in a weak position in South Vietnam. And until that situation turns itself around and we can negotiate from strength, and the communists understand that we're winning, not losing, of course we're not going to negotiate.
Galbraith would laugh at that and say, weakness, the greatest country in the world, the strongest nation in the world, contending with Vietnam, a country of 50 million people that has no air force, that has no industry, and that is just emerging as a nation. The United States has to be afraid of that, and not show weakness. And it's not weakness, which the president said in his inaugural address. It is not weakness to discuss or to negotiate from strength.